would first of all like to begin by commending the Ovaherer Nama people for your courageous struggle for repair and restitution and holistic forms of redress. I commend you because as an African born in the diaspora, in particular in the United Kingdom, there is too often a perception in the corporate mass media that reparations is just an issue that affects those of us Africans in the diaspora. And in fact, many of the chief advocates of reparatory justice coming from the diaspora, I think have also fed into that misconception. Whereas we know that the movement for reparations began here on the continent of Africa. Through the various phases of our enslavement, our colonization, and now the contemporary era of neo-colonialism. And of course, the genocide that the Ovaherer and Nama people faced, but also other genocides that have happened on the continent of Africa. So this is the home of the movement. And all too often, I think the voices of Africans from the continent around reparatory justice are not heard and promoted loudly enough. And even when those voices are promoted, there is an attempt to push it within a narrative that really fits within, I think, an African diaspora experience. So I commend you. I commend you for holding up your struggle to the world and for reminding us that justice does not sleep, and neither will we until we secure the justice that we require. So in terms of my title, which I was given, I hope that you've read it, but I'm just going to reiterate: the right of African indigenous peoples to demand restitution / reparations for their enslavement by colonialism, and determining the course and nature of such a demand with special reference to the Ovaherer and Nama in Namibia, their quest for restitution from the Federal Republic of Germany, directly engaging the government here in Namibia, and the role and place of the Namibian government in particular. So that's what I've been asked to speak about, and in particular, my presentation will answer the questions on the rights of the victims in terms of Herero and Nama people, in terms of international law, to champion their own cause and to have their voices heard through direct representation. Also, I seek to answer the question, could the Namibian government really claim legitimacy to represent and speak on behalf of the affected communities in the absence of a clear mandate by the affected communities? And also to touch on some of the international experiences and precedents in this regard that the Namibian affected communities could emulate. But there are actually few, and so that's where we're going to have to be a bit creative. So let me now try and move on in terms of the presentation slides, and I hope that this works. So forget all of that. I've already been adequately introduced. These are just some pictures to just ground me, to show that I am not a stranger to the Herero people, and of course, your paramount chief here, who I was honoured to meet in Birmingham, Bristol, not Birmingham, Bristol, earlier this year. And I was introduced to the community, who I actually did not know that there was a Herero community and even Nama people in the UK by General Owets Shongorero. So I need to acknowledge them because it's out of that initial engagement that I've actually come to meet other members of the Ovaherer Genocide Foundation, in particular Sisters Esther and Kambanda, who joined us this year in London for the annual, what's called African Emancipation Day Reparations March, where Esther was actually headlining the march and talking about the Herero struggle before the wider international social movement for African reparations, which we refer in shorthand to the ISMAR. So that is my introduction to the issues and the communities here. So moving swiftly on, I don't make any assumptions when I go into an audience about people understanding, or we say really overstanding, the meaning of reparations. And I believe it's important to keep reinforcing the true meaning of reparations, because so many times, even when we know better, I think that our language reinforces this notion that reparations is just about a bag of money, which we've heard already. So we have to continually be reminding ourselves that that's not actually what the word means. So these are just two images from the Reparations March that we have, which is an annual march, and this year, coming up 2018, will be our 5th year. So one is a banner. We have children's banner making workshops for the march, and the banner says reparations is internal and external repair. And the other one says, reparations or Repair Nation is reparations. So I want you to hold those two images and the messages in your mind as I continue to elaborate. So in the ISMAR, the International Social Movement for African Reparations, we actually recognize two main definitions of reparations. The first one is not mine. Although I think I have been one of those most championing the Chimwezu definition, certainly since I've been involved in the movement some 17 years, and have sort of popularized Chimwezu's definition to other audiences. So Chimwezu is a Nigerian public intellectual, and he advanced this definition at the first conference on reparations for enslavement, colonization, and neo-colonization that took place in Abuja, Nigeria in 1993, under the auspices of the then group of 12 eminent persons, sponsored by the then Organization of African Unity, and really spearheaded by the then now deceased, in fact, murdered Chief Abiola of Nigeria. So Chimwezu reminded us that money is not even what one reparation is about. Reparation is mostly about making repairs. Self-made repairs on ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, institutional repairs, technological repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, and educational repairs. Repairs of every type that we need in order to recreate and sustain Black societies. He goes on to state that more important than any monies to be received and more fundamental than any lands to be recovered is the opportunity that the reparations campaign offers us for the rehabilitation of Black people, African people, by Black people, for Black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our material condition, our collective reputation, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religious and political traditions, and our family institutions. But first and foremost, for the rehabilitation of our minds. He goes on to state that the most important part of reparation is our self-repair, which is internal repair. That slide that had internal and external. He says the change it will bring about in our understanding of our history, of ourselves and of our destiny, the change it will bring about in our place in the world. So that is a conceptual definition. That's like the framework, the big picture stuff. But conceptual definitions are sometimes difficult to operationalize. And so we also recognize the operational framework of the international reparations framework, and that is the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. Now, these principles were really codified in 2005, but just to point out, they have come about after centuries, because actually reparations is a principle that is centuries old. So it is a modern formulation into a framework of practice and custom and law and tradition that has gone back centuries. And under the International Reparations Framework, there are really 5 key aspects to reparations in international law. Now, these being restitution, and I'll say a bit more afterwards, compensation. Now, compensation is obviously where many people stick to when they think about the word reparations, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So restitution, and according to Elazar Balkan, Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, restitution is meant to restore the victim group, to the original situation before the various violations were committed. Now, according to Elazar Balkan, restitution is the entire spectrum of attempts to rectify a historical injustice. So where would the Ovaherer and Nama people have been? What would your society have looked like but for colonialism, German colonialism, other forms of European colonialism? Okay, those are some of the things that we need to think about. And actually restitution involves aspects such as restoration of lands, citizenship, homeland. So the fact that we are in Namibia today, which did not exist at the time of the genocide, so true restitution cannot just be seen within the confines of the modern day nation state of Namibia. I mean, if that is a fact, if we were to really follow international law, okay? So we've only ever had partial of anything. And in fact, it's important to recognize and commend our fathers and mothers of the African liberation struggle. But we also have to recognize that we were fighting in very uneven terrain. And so many of what was secured actually ended up cementing the injustices of colonialism via adhering to the 1884-1885 Congress of Berlin consensus with these current borders. And the harms that have been produced by that are still continuing and will not cease, okay, until we change things. Compensation requires that wrongdoers pay damages to persons and groups harmed by past conduct, and it's for any economically accessible damage that is proportional to the gravity of the violation. So it's not actually just about money. It's about putting an economic value on damage, harm, violations. It could include the actual economic value of lost land, revenue, resources, industries, mines, all of that could come into compensation. So compensatory reparations authorize the payment of damages for not only physical, political, but also psychological, economic, and other harms suffered. Now, PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe that I represent, we have this sort of statement here that says our struggle for reparations is not asking anyone to give us anything or do anything charitable for us. It is a long overdue demand for what, by all the tenets of justice, is rightfully ours. We are demanding complete economic, political, social, cultural, and spiritual justice. That is justice in its true holistic meaning, Receiving the financial component of reparations will be meaningful only if it serves the holistic purpose and strengthens the integral whole of our people's self-repair process. Although no sum of money could ever erase our pain or wash away the blood of our glorious ancestors that was shed at the hands of their enslavers and colonizers, we must have all that is necessary for restoring ourselves and future generations, which is key, to the correct Pan-African heights of global justice for all. So that is our position statement on compensation. And really, compensation is about a long-term commitment to financing, resourcing, and supporting all the efforts that African people, and in the Ovaherer Nama case, Ovaherer Nama make, and their allies contribute to repairing the damage and trying to make good on the losses suffered as a result of the genocide, colonialism, and modern-day neo-colonialism, okay? And it would include restitution of the value of unjust enrichment based upon enslaved and colonial labour, as well as the expropriation of lands, minerals, and raw materials. So that is what would be included in compensation in terms of the modern day economy, who owns it, who controls it, who benefits from it. This is still the ongoing continuum of the genocide and everything else that accompanied that, you know, colonialism, which is just one word. But there isn't the time, obviously, in the limited time that I have, of which I've used up quite a bit already, to really elaborate on everything that happened during colonialism. And of course, you know this better than I do. So this is just a quote from Osojifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, first leader of independent Ghana, who was a reparationist, but is not often thought of in that way in terms of his struggles. And he reminded us that we must have every inch of our lands, every one of our mines and industries. So it's not just about receiving money and maintaining the status quo where we are forever beggars and servants in our own land. It is about us once again becoming the vicegerents, the custodians of the resources of Mother Earth and this land, this sacred, beautiful land that we now call Africa. That is what it's about. Okay. So rehabilitation is not really defined, but it's self-explanatory really, and it includes medical and psychological, psychotherapeutic care and support, as well as access to legal services, access to justice, and various forms of social programs that are needed to uplift a people that have experienced massive violations of their, not only human rights, but their group rights as a people. The Herero and the Nama people in particular I'm focusing on. So all of the intergenerational legacies, negative legacies that we are carrying, including some of those legacies in terms of how we see ourselves, that is what we need to rehabilitate. We need to rebuild family, community, culture, nation. The fact that as people, you are divided along these colonial borders. So some in Botswana, some in South Africa, the majority here. This is part of the harm, that fracturing of communities, because ultimately, in the basic common sense understanding of the word or term reparations, it involves a transformation of the group of people who have been injured, who have been violated in terms of their group rights. It has to result in the empowerment and transformation of the people. That's what's often missed out in a reparatory justice process. And so if we understand that, we know that nobody who has truly oppressed you can liberate you, can empower you. And that is why the driving force behind the repair must be us. We must set the agenda on what that is to be. Yeah? So finally, the last components of reparations under international law are satisfaction, which includes official apologies, criminal prosecutions, various forms of truth-seeking. So where were people buried? Where, you know, the issue of the skulls that have been taken away, that I know there's a big campaign about having them returned. And it's not just about skulls, it's, you know, this is about, you know, people having proper burial rights, funeral rights, in terms of the souls of our people that are trapped, literally trapped. And how can we be at peace ancestrally? How can we expect blessings and support in our quest if we don't work to free and untrap those souls of our people? Okay? There's also the guarantees of non-repetition. Now, this is the aspect of African people's reparation struggle that gets the least emphasized. The Jewish people who went through a Holocaust, a form of Holocaust, say never again will they go through what they went through. That is guarantees of non-repetition. And let us remember that the first act of reparation, and it's not one that, it's actually quite a controversial example, but the first act of reparation of the Jewish people was establishing a homeland, which they call the State of Israel. And those of you who know how that state was established will know why that is a controversial example, but I don't have time to go into that now. So even though it is often stated about all the various precedents that there are in terms of people receiving compensation, we, as I believe African people, Herero people, Nama people, who are African people, we must not seek to emulate models of repair that end up causing dispossession and harm to others. And that is a central principle of ethics in reparatory justice. We have to put some ethics back into our movement and not just say, well, they got theirs, so we want to get ours too, and to hell with everybody else and be damned with the consequences. As mothers and fathers of human civilization, we have a big task and a big duty and a big responsibility to set the correct standard, because we have always been the standard bearers, always have been, in terms of how we have waged our struggles. Even when they were about us, they have ended up benefiting other nationalities and ethnicities and other social groups who have learned from and been inspired by our struggle. So even there's a list, for instance, I am part of, or used to be part of, the National Coalition for Blacks, Reparations for Blacks in America. And there's a famous list that they popularise that talks about all these groups that have received compensation, and it mentions Indigenous American groups and Aboriginal groups and so forth, and as a way to say, well, look, we haven't received anything. But actually, if we break down that list and we analyse it, what we will see is that the people who, it is claimed, received some compensation, really, what, Indigenous Americans living on reservations today in a continent that is their land, that cannot be a model that we emulate. And they themselves are actually fighting to restore sovereignty of what they call our America, and it's America's north, south, central as well. So even this notion of Caribbean, it's on indigenous land. What the Jamaican reggae artist Chronic sings about as being captured lands, okay? So it's no model. The Aboriginal people in Australia want their land back. They are colonised. The people who were taken from England, many of them captives, are the ones ruling over them now. So that is why some of us are working with the Sovereign Union of Australia that is about restoring pre-colonial sovereign nations, Aboriginal nations, and they do not respect the territorial borders of the modern state of Australia. That is a European imposition. So let us draw inspiration. These are some of the precedents. And I'm now quoting from my co-vice chair in PARCO, Kofi Maoli-Klug, who says that in actually comparing our case to these other cases, such as Japanese Americans, British prisoners of war, the Inuit, and so forth, we must understand that such restitutions have never threatened the Eurocentric global establishment of white racist supremacy in the way and manner true reparations to African people will result in the black empowerment of Africans and their galvanization of the revolutionary transformation of the present unjust order of the world. Chinwezu is therefore correct in pointing out, as Osajifo Kwame Nkrumah did long ago, that the most important aspect of reparations is not the money that the campaign may or may not bring. The most important part of reparations is our self-repair. The change it will bring about in our understanding of our history, of ourselves and of our destiny, and the change it will bring about in our place in the world. For we need to move from this old global order where genocide, which some of us refer to in the Kiswahili term as the maangamizi, and that includes everything that we suffered, where the genocide happened to us, happened to the Herero people, the Nama people, to a different global order where genocide will never again happen, not just to Herero or Nama, but to any of us, by extension as African people. That is the guarantees of non-repetition that we must seek to bring about. And we must recognize that if we do not do this properly, we are leaving this unfinished business of African liberation to our children, to our children's children, Americans, is that, of the continent that they actually call Abialala, is that when they are thinking about and conceptualizing and planning for what reparations will look like, and it begins with the restoration of their sovereignty. For them, it doesn't begin with money, okay? They say that we must adopt a 7 generations principle, which means, and this is actually from the Iroquois nation, and that basically means that whatever we think we're settling on today in this generation, whatever we say reparations are about, we have to look at what will be the impact 7 generations from today. 7 generations from today. So money in an economy that we don't own and control, where's it going? Where's it going? Where is the succession planning? So that our children are not left to come now and fight the same battles that we are fighting and that have been fought before we were born. These are the guarantees of non-repetition, and it is a huge task. But we have to conceptually understand it first, because if we don't conceptually understand it, we will think we're making progress, but really what we're doing is looting the freedom account of our progeny. Okay, that's what we will be doing. Moving swiftly on, I'm not going to be able to go through all of these slides, okay, because of time, but I just wanted to touch on some key aspects. Now, I'm very aware of the context here, in particular, the fact that there is now a dialogue between the Namibian government and the Federal Republic of Germany, supposedly, around reparations, supposedly, including the case and claims of the Ovaherer Nama people. But we must, I have to say, as a Pan-Africanist, and especially if there are any representatives of the government here, or the ruling party, as a Pan-African family discussion, I have to say to you, from the movement, the wider Pan-African movement, that it is not correct. It is not correct what is happening. It is not correct that there isn't the granting of a three-way dialogue, including the affected communities of the Ovaherer Nama genocide. It is not correct. And we have to say this as Pan-Africanists, because we know that the ruling party in particular prides itself on Pan-Africanism. Yeah. Okay, and many of us as Pan-Africanists are silent on this issue. But there are many too who recognizes that as family talk now, we have to talk truthfully and tough to each other. So what is actually going on is a conflation of development assistance and reparations. It's a conflation. But there are differences. So this is a quote from Ruben Karenza, International Center for Transitional Justice. Development, which is really what's going on with that special initiative, German Namibia special initiative, is not a substitute for reparation. It is not. While development is a right for all who may be in a particular territory, country, etc., reparations are a right for a specific subset or group of people. Those who have been victims of human rights violations, so reparation has intrinsic value in that it restores victims. And it's not correct to say, well, we were all just victims, yes, of colonialism and the various degradations of it, but not everyone was a victim of the Ovaherer Nama genocide. Fact. And of course, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. So this is a chart, you probably can't see it very well, but it goes into the key elements of reparations programs, key elements in development assistance, looks at objectives, the underlying principles, the type of assistance output, duty bearers, providers, and also the stakeholders. Now, key thing in terms of objectives, reparations are about redressing systemic violations of human and people's rights, and development assistance is about post-conflict recovery and or poverty alleviation. Two different things, okay? The underlying principles of reparation are about fulfilling individual and collective or group or people's rights. And in terms of development assistance, it's addressing collective needs with recognition of individual rights and vulnerabilities of the whole population. So it's totally different, okay? So in terms of the outputs around reparations, symbolic compensations, public apologies, and reinstatement, so restitution, redistribution of lands and so forth, and different forms of payment. Whereas with development assistance, it focuses on livelihoods, so-called economic empowerment, educational opportunities, health services, and other public services. Now, it is also the case that if we are talking about reparations to the affected communities, you cannot totally divorce it from development of those communities. But you must recognize that the roots of the two are two different starting places, yes? And what we have with the government of Namibia is really attempting to conflate development and reparations. And of course, the Ovaherer and Nama people have every right in international law, in African law, in just basic sense of morality and justice to argue that they must be at the negotiating table. I don't really see where that's a conflict or why that is not being supported and facilitated. And as Pan-Africanists and those of us who are internationalists as well, we commit to you as Ovaherers and Namas that we will do everything within our power to also support your struggle and conscientize the wider Pan-African movement and challenge them where we are fudging this issue, okay? Because ultimately an injustice to you is an injustice to all of us, okay? So on the question of representation, The key thing about political representation is that it's about acting in the interests of the represented in a manner that is responsive to them. So there are 4 possible types of representation: formalistic, symbolic, descriptive and substantive, okay? And I'm rushing through here now because of time. So descriptive representation is being represented by somebody or an individual or group with similar identity characteristics as particular voters or constituencies. But you don't really even have much of that as Ovahereros and Namas. When I was asking today at lunch about how many people represent you in the government, in Parliament, so few. Okay, so few. So you don't even have people who you can say, oh, that's a Ovaherero, because it's not just any Ovaherero. We know the nature of divide and rule, right? We know that, okay? So, but that's a start. That's a start. And then what we really need to be aiming for is substantive Ovaherero and Nama representation. And this is where the policy concerns of yourselves as particular constituencies get adequate representation, and so that people in various levels of office, locally, regionally and nationally, they represent your strategic concerns, and it's about taking those on board. So it's the right to be represented in terms of your culture, your values, your traditions, what it is you're saying you want to happen as the traditional authorities and so forth, the traditional leadership. That's really, you know, these are basic things around the law of representation. And in fact, the easiest example I can give to you is the struggle of women, the struggle for women's rights. And women have fought for substantive equality, to say, well, it's not just about having any old woman. We need to have women that can represent the interests of women as a group, not women who are just going to represent the hegemony, in terms of the patriarchy, because, you know, many of us women might get selected to conform to the status quo. So that is the best example, I think, a most successful example of where we've seen substantive representation. When it comes to African people's representation, it's not enough to just say, well, we're all Africans, because we know that, yes, whilst we are part of a wider Pan-African nation, we have our specificities. Okay, as peoples, and even as Pan-Africanists, it might sound controversial, but the model of Pan-Africanism is not and cannot be about just the uniting of the existing colonial borders. In fact, we in PARCO have been advocating a model of Pan-Africanism that is about uniting the indigenous peoples and nationalities of this continent, who are already organising according to our ethnic and linguistic and national groupings, irrespective of the colonial borders and whatever passport that we may have. That is how you indigenize Pan-Africanism. It can't just be about conferences or state and conference rooms and whatever. We have to indigenize the methodologies, the theories, and applying them to the concrete circumstances of our people. So in my conclusion now, because of time, I've reached my time, so I have to really begin to, I did tell you about the timing, that it's important for us in moving forward to fully define and recognise the debt that is owed to the Ovaherer and Nama people. And so I've spoken about the term Ma'angamizi that we use, and this is some of the evolving language of the International Social Movement for African Reparations. And Ma'angamizi kind of means African Holocaust, but because we're always redefining, we talk about a Holocaust, which is a morally monstrous act of genocide that is not only against the people, but a crime against humanity, a crime against our Creator as well. as our people. Now, one of the key things to mention, and I know that you are very much championing genocide as defined by the 1948 Genocide Convention, which is fine, but we have to recognise 1948, what was the condition of African people? We didn't really get to shape what got accepted into the Genocide Convention. And even Dr. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who coined the term genocide, actually what he submitted to be included in the convention, a lot of it was taken out. So I'm advocating that we don't just stick to a formalistic reading of the law and convention in terms of what's called black letter law. We have to take what we call an extra legal approach, where we go beyond the existing to really look at where there are deficits. But even then, Dr. Raphael Lemkin told us that genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and the other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. So only you will know how much of those impositions are still there in our identity, our culture, our self-concept, okay? Because the genocide is not just the physical destruction. It is about the destruction of the foundational ways of life of a people that help that people carry itself into posterity. So, of course, the fact that 80% of Ovaherer, 50%, I believe, of Nama people were physically exterminated is key. But for those of you that remain, it is that living genocide that you are a shadow of your former self that we need to recognize. We also need to recognize the modern day paradox that we have. That highlights neo-colonialism. I would say even here in Namibia, I'm using Nkrumah's quote here, that the earth here is rich, yet the products that come from above and below the soil continue to enrich not Africans predominantly, but groups and individuals who operate to Africa's impoverishment. That is so relevant now, although he was talking about this in the 60s. He said that neo-colonialism was the last and final, and in fact most destructive stage of imperialism. So we must still see the imperial context of modern day Namibia in terms of the legacies. And this is a fascinating quote from Kevin Cahill, a Scottish author who wrote a book, Who Owns the World? The Hidden Facts Behind Land Ownership. And he tells us that poverty and wealth are not, as is often thought, opposites. Instead, the two words predicate a problem, which is poverty, and indicate its solution, which is wealth. Land, that which upon which we all stand, is the single most common characteristic of wealth worldwide, and the commonest characteristic of the poor of the planet is the opposite, landlessness. What's happening to the land conference here? Why was it postponed? The land issue is a burning issue, and some of us who are not living on the African continent cannot fathom how we have embraced largely the elites, willing buyer, willing seller. Was the land bought from your people? No. How do we reinforce structurally this violence, this epistemic violence that was actually encoded in their law? Rule of law. They tell us it's legal. By whose standards? Whose standards of law? Not our standards. So dignified Africans have to rediscover what is ours and stop mimicking interests that are not ours. Okay? We have to stop that. That is our duty. Because it really does sound foolish when we're saying some of these things. Chief Rukoro stated that as Ovahereros, that you are not only descendants of the act of genocide, that you are also direct victims of that act that has plunged you into intergenerational poverty. So compensation is one thing, but restitution of the land and everything that comes off the land, the mines and the industries, uranium, all that you have here, you are not benefiting from. So there is no reason why any of you should be impoverished in your own homeland. Yes. we cannot, as African people, Pan-Africanists, defend this. And we have to encourage you to be strong and to know that actually there are so many of us in the diaspora who are willing to support you, because the best that we've ever produced in our struggle has been when we saw a fighting Africa and a fighting African people, not a bowed African people. That doesn't inspire anyone. That doesn't inspire our young. What we're seeing in Europe is many of our young are going and fighting for ISIS and all kinds of things. Why? Because they're being inspired around a vision. Now, I'm not going into that. I'm not advocating it, but I'm just telling you the reality of what's happening in our communities. We have stopped inspiring our young because the young are naturally rebellious. Think about how some of you were when you were younger. Some of you must have wanted to change the world. And as we get older, we somehow become docile and compliant. Our young are engaged in resistance all over Africa, all over the world. And we have to stop being afraid. There's a saying that was popularized by, I think, Peter Tosh in a reggae song about, many of us want to go to heaven, but no, we don't want to die. Yeah, we want the benefits of our freedom. We want our resources back, but we don't want to do anything controversial to get it. Yeah. We want to be nice, genteel, diplomatic, as if that's how people are with us. Even today, it's not going to work. So in terms of where you go from here, it's important. And I did say I was closing, just give me a couple of more minutes. This is Kofi, my colleague, co-vice chair, Pan-Africanist, jurisconsult, lawyer, who I have learned so much from. He says the use of law is one of the most important instruments in our struggle for reparations. Indeed, the need to locate our claim to restitution for the damages caused by gross violations of African sovereignty must raise immediately for us the essential question of whose framework, whose law, and whose justice. Whose is it? So what we're advocating, and by wrapping up, I did say that, is that, yes, by all means, continue the route that you have gone. But some of us will say to you honestly as brothers and sisters who have a common interest in the case and in supporting you to victory, we do not believe and advocate that we can ever expect to receive justice in European courts. I mean, I know the statute that is being used in terms of the American case, but let's look at that objectively. How comes it hasn't been able to benefit the indigenous Americans who live there? So we must understand how white supremacy works. Sometimes it will make overtures to one group of us, because what those who uphold the system of law, and Karl Marx taught us that law is really the will of the ruling classes enacted into legislation. Everything the European colonizers did, they legislated for it in law. There was an act for the Berlin Congress. Berlin Conference, 1884-85, that legitimized the land dispossession. Now, it was not legal, because we cannot say what Hitler did to the Jews was legal, but powerful groups will always legitimize injustice and codify it in law. So we must be very mindful that whilst we may tactically use European law and legal institutions and frameworks, and for, as people like myself, we say as critical lawyers, we use it to push that to, the system a bit further. But we cannot rest on our laurels and think that we will get justice there. Our starting point must be a reversion to our own law, because we had law. We were international players. You had law. And you still have law as Hereros and Namas. Our laws have become marginalized, but the starting point is that there was a violation of treaties, a violation of your own law. And remember that it's not just the courtrooms where we have to spend exorbitant amounts of money on a few hotshot lawyers. How does that serve the majority of our people in terms of the transformation and empowerment that reparations must bring about? We must recognize the greater courtroom, which is the courtroom of public opinion, so that your case is waged publicly, starting from your own law. And we've been advocating a strategy around people's international tribunals, because if we talk about International Court of Justice, again, European courts that have been globalized in terms of what they say is international law. So the scholarship amongst us must be tight. We must have more research. And the world is changing because African people are rediscovering ourselves again in terms of the knowledge creation. We even have European scholars writing about this and telling us that actually you had your own law and Europeans violated international law, and a minority of human population cannot now suddenly become the arbiters of justice for the majority that were colonized and brutalized and had their lands taken away and their sovereignty literally, torn apart. So what I would say there is that we need to popularize. We have this notion of the Ubuntu Gotlas, which are a People's International Tribunal. There's no reason why, at the same time as the court case going on in America, that we can't be having our own local sittings, that this must be filmed, televised, shown to the world. And we must also expose the government here. And I say this as a Pan-Africanist and as a friend of all the African people here, as a sister, actually, to all the African people here. Okay? This is not about negative ethnicity, so-called tribalism. I don't use that word. Because we're one people. But at the same time, when we have a section of our family doing things that are injurious to the whole, we have an interest, all of us, for the well-being of our whole, to point that out. And if you were challenging more, we saw more of that, you would get a lot more Pan-Africanist and internationalist, in terms of our allies, support to your cause. And I know, or from what I've heard about the government here and its own self-image, that would embarrass them, because they would not want to be seen to be people and their example being held up before the world. And that would actually help you in the wider other strategies that you are choosing. So we're not hearing enough of that. And I know it's difficult for some of you, but as I said, we are not going to get very far without sacrifice. Many of our people have already been killed. And we are not the generation that must be cowardly. We will be victorious if you stand up, but equally some of us may end up being sacrificed because we have not yet achieved the freedom, and you have not yet achieved it here. So the vision of the Africa, the Namibia, which may very well change, because not just in this country, all over Africa, especially Southern Africa, our people are disquieted. They're refusing to accept these borders. They are, occupying lands. They are being shot down in South Africa, miners who really just wanted better working conditions. That is the modern-day neo-colonies that we inhabit in this region, okay? So the vision of an Africa has to be a much different vision, okay? And I'm just going to conclude with what we're advocating. Ma'atu Buntu Man. It's a Pan-African unity of communities. So that vision of African unity of our forefathers and foremothers is ancient. Going back to some of our earliest civilizations, such as in Kemet, it didn't just start with Africans in the diaspora in the 20th century, which is a traditional reading of Pan-Africanism that is really state-centered. Pan-Africanism has always been about people-centered, people first. Because the very day in modern-day states are actually, as Chimwezu said, neo-colonial Bantustan. So the vision of Africa has to be a transformed one that unites the various peoples, ethnicities, and nationalities that are already here. And those of us in the diaspora who are seeking to repatriate and to be welcomed back into our homeland, We don't want to do so at the expense of dispossessing indigenous Africans just because we were trafficked hundreds of years ago. So there is some of that thinking, but some of us are saying, again, according to reparations ethics, we are establishing what we call Ma'at Ubuntu Jammers, and really Ma'at Ubuntu man is a state based on the principles of Ma'at, the ancient ethical ideal in terms of Kemet, a black civilization. So all this thing about good governance and democracy, we had our own models, okay? And we were taken off of the course of our own history making due to European colonialism that demonized everything that came out of our own minds and our own thoughts. So we have got better models, and we're saying that this is the future, because everything that our great liberators were fighting for, they were fighting for a different model of African liberation. We don't have to accept the borders that are there now. And we connect to Ma'at Ubuntu man as diasporan Africans through establishing what we call African Heritage Communities for National Self-Determination, which is the argument we're making in Europe, that we are a special group of people because we come from all these different African groupings, but we have decided to unite under one African national banner. And so the Africa of today is not going to be the Africa of the future. It's not. And we must have that vision, as all great revolutionaries have. And as Thomas Sankara told us, that all great visionaries have to kind of have a certain degree of madness, in the sense of being told, no, it's impossible. We can't see that far ahead. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Because that's why we are here, because we had people who were visionaries and they thought beyond, they thought into the eons, they thought generations ahead. And now we've become so short-termist and myopic as a people that is actually going to be towards our downfall. So brothers and sisters, I leave you on that to say that it's important for us, Ma'at Ubuntu man is part of one of the big political goals. But we know there are lots of in-between, short-term, medium-term, long-terms. What we're also suggesting, in all humility, and we can't tell you what to do as Ovaherer and Namas, but we want to hear more, and we're suggesting that you also focus on developing your own plan. So it's fine to go after compensation, because that is a part of reparations, but it's only a small part. And we want to hear about the plan. What is the self-repair plan for the developed? Force our will and not receive, but take that which rightfully belongs to us. Take it. Then you know that there is a plan that you're already working to. And some of these things we can be doing. So on the way in here, I was passing a few memorial sites where Herero people in particular had been massacred. And I was asking, is there a plaque? Is there anything that tells people, educates people about what's happened here? And no, there isn't on a lot of them. So yes, that does require some degree of resourcing, but we have to be creative as a people, as we were in the past. So we have many of the resources amongst us to do what must be done. And when we see more of that, when we start honouring much better our freedom fighters, then a lot more support will come to us and people will be on your side to join you to the logical conclusion of your struggle to victory. So brothers and sisters, I leave you with that. And just to sort of encourage you about a historic development that was initiated in London, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. It is a cross-community network in that it's not only African scholars and activists, it includes non-African, including European, Asian, but people who are researching the African reparative justice struggles. We had representation of 2 members of the Herero community living in the UK, General Shongorero and a brother called Kumojua, and they were really, teaching us sharing the knowledge about your struggle here. And as the African movement for reparations intensifies and more people become attracted to even researching our people's struggle and its national and different dimensions, intersectional dimensions, including class and gender dimensions, then again you have a resource, a global resource, because one thing we know is that to get us to the next phase, we need the best of our minds. We need to pull together the best of the knowledge that we have created around what works and what doesn't work. So it's important for you to also link into this network about the knowledge that you are creating here, because there's a lot that we can learn in the wider movement. And I close with the Chimwezi quote, and I'm really finishing now. Now we who are campaigning for reparations cannot hope to change the world without changing ourselves. We cannot hope to change the world without changing our ways of seeing the world, our ways of thinking about the world, our ways of organising our world, our ways of working and dreaming in our world. All these and more must change for the better. The type of black man and black woman that was made by the genocide, that was made to feel inferior by slavery, colonization, genocide, etc., that was steeped in colonial attitudes and values, that type of black will not be able to bring about the post-reparation global order. It's a global order that we are fashioning into being. They will not be able to bring about the post-reparation global order into being without changing profoundly in the process that has begun. That type of black will not even be appropriate for the post-reparation global order unless thoroughly and suitably reconstructed. So, reparation, like charity, must begin with ourselves, with the making of the new black person, with the making of the new black world. Thank you. So you have many scholars, like, for instance, people like Dr. Noko Rashidi, who argues that this was an African, it wasn't just, an imposition on us. There are others who talk about Africa, going back to Africa and Kemet and so forth. So it's not so much, I agree that we can use other terms, but we also have to look at our liberation in phases. And at the moment, what we have with the people who might self-define or get classified as being of African descent is that we don't really have a global geopolitical identity in the same way that a Jewish person does. And we know that there's no homogenous group of Jews. There's all these different, communities and ethnic groups who will identify with Jewishness. So the notion of being Africanness is about linking us back to a power base. And at the moment, we are the majority on this continent, what we call our motherland. We can change the name. But as long as there is a place that is on a map that the majority of the world sees and calls Africa, some of us believe it's important to link ourselves and identify with that landmass in terms of a geopolitical global identity. That if I go by my passport, I'm British, because that's the passport that I hold. Obviously, I'm not British, I'm not Anglo-Saxon, but I've been incorporated into Britishness due to the British Empire that at one point was ruling 3/4 of planet Earth. So Africanness, and you read a quote from myself, has to be a concept, if we keep it, that is futuristic, because it's not a homogeneousness. We are many different so-called African, or whatever we want to call ourselves, ethnicities and nationalities in this room. The Africa of the future will be a harmonization of all of our differences into a unity of a whole. That is the process of identity building that must accompany nation building, that must accompany our political struggles. Now, in terms of why with a K, because many of our indigenous African languages do not have the C. It was always a K. And in fact, Africa with a C, many of the languages, I'm not saying there were not any, African with a C is something that was the European, if you like, reformulation. Okay, so many of us who define African with a K do so in recognition that we are more aligning with indigenous African conceptualizations of who we are, the people that people this planet. But as I said, we are the majority on this continent. We can change the name, but I don't believe that we should get involved in just narrow semantic arguments. This is a struggle for power. And it's about what the majority of our people can understand, recognize, and support. And many people today will, even if they don't call themselves African, who are living in the diaspora will recognize that they are people of African descent. We must also recognize the process that we are in by way of shaping international law as a group. Yes, as a group of people, in the same way that indigenous people, who again are indigenous all over the planet, so it's not one ethnicity or nationality, there is a UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous People. And now that we're in the decade for people of African descent, there is a body for those who are human rights practitioners. There is now increasing recognition of a specific, if you like, formulation of rights for our people that is blended from the struggles of so-called African peoples and groups with the indigenous peoples as well. So we are in a very unique point in our history making and in our evolution as not only receivers of law, but as makers and shapers of law. So that's what I would say on that. Now, following on in terms of, you mentioned, my brother, about the role of youth and that many of the young people are kind of in a different direction. Do I need this? Or? Okay, I'm going in a different direction. I would agree with you in terms of the masses of our young. But I do not agree that young people do not identify with this struggle. When I joined the movement, I was only in my 20s. That's still quite young. And I'm not actually that old. I may seem older because of the weight that I carry and the role that I've played, okay? But I'm actually quite a young person. And when I joined the movement, there were older Pan-Africanists who dismissed me because it was like, who is she? We've been on Liberation Road for 30 years. I've never been heard of, was not schooled in black nationalism, Pan-Africanism. I was just an ordinary young person who knew where my heart was and what my destiny and mission was. And obviously, because I'm female as well, that was a big part of it. A lot of our struggle, the leadership has tended to be male. But through doing the work, and being supported and tutored and mentored by older activists, I have grown into a movement that I recognise was here before I was born, and even the mentors that I have. So the thing about reparations is that we have a culture now that has been imposed on us that tries to separate our young from even the older ones amongst us. That is part of the cultural genocide, because in our struggles it's always been intergenerational. And if anything, we have to look at our own failures. We're good at talking about what others have done to us. We have to also be mature and courageous enough to look at where many of us dropped the ball. Where many perhaps who had thought, well, we've achieved something now, and that what we fought for, our young people don't need to know, don't need to also be schooled in that. Because if you look at all the other groups who are powerful on this planet, they do not just leave their young for other people to socialise and educate them. That's something that typically happens with African people. We are not in control of the institutions that are teaching our young, and we are seeing the effects of it. So many of our young are being encouraged to go down particular ways of life that partially is seen to be about youth rebellion and experimentation, but is far more damaging and catastrophic for us, given the fact that we are still experiencing genocide holistically and the specific legacies of specific affected communities who were targeted for who they were as well, or who they are. So that's what I would say. And in the movement in the UK, we link with many youth movements here in Africa that are younger people, under 25, who are identifying with this struggle, and they bring new dimensions to it. They might not sit in a conference or university lecture like this, but they're using popular culture, they're using other art forms. hip-hop music and spoken word and different ways to get these messages out, but we are one movement. So I'm not really agreeing with this separation. I think that that is part of the problem, but we must close the gap between us. Now, in relation to the question about the recognising that through, obviously, products of history, you are not all one, particularly as Herero, and some of you will have different identities and so forth that you've acquired along the way. And you are asking me to explain the danger of you staging protests in the different countries where you have also perhaps made home, whether it be Botswana or South Africa or what have you. I wouldn't say there's a danger, and I'm not sure if it was a trick question. I wouldn't say there's a danger in doing that, but I also think that we have to take the argument to its logical conclusion. So as Herero people, you have a distinct struggle that is connected to all African people's struggles, but you have to identify back to your roots. Okay, that's what you have to do if you're going to be strong in whatever your case is. And what you will often find when we go into these other arenas, and there have been many, and it's not just yourselves as Herero and Nama that are taking this route, many of the other African communities in South Africa, African diaspora communities who don't necessarily link back to an existing country, have also been encouraged to go down this route of court cases in European defined legal terrains. They are very limited in terms of the outcome. And what we have to do is do an honest assessment of what have been the outcomes and benefits and impacts of all these court cases. And I think that we will find that it's been limited in terms of the group injustices that we have faced. So I would actually encourage you, wherever you are, to link back to the struggle, to agitate wherever we are. We're doing it in the UK. We're even tackling the British government. It's not the German government, but the British government was complicit in the genocide that happened here. So we can tackle them on that end, especially those of us that have citizenship in terms of Britain. So we should encourage activism wherever people find ourselves. But then we have to also carry the argument in terms of who are the people that were affected? What is the genesis of this struggle? And we have to recognise that we can't just rest on the existing identities, national status, or even passports that we may hold, because that will go against us. We are in the process of rebuilding ourselves, re-establishing ourselves, and even a reconfiguration of what it means to be Herero, what it means to be Nama, what it means to be Ovamba, whatever. All the other peoples that make up this land is going to be part of that process, because none of us are a static community, and that is the thing as African people. We have always transformed ourselves and evolved ourselves, taking the best from our past to guide us into our future. But equally, the things that do not serve us anymore, we have to leave behind, because that's not going to liberate us. And the way forward is not, in my view, these narrow court cases. I'm saying this not just because it's a political, ideological view. I'm saying it as a legal practitioner who has been involved in some of these cases, in particular the Mau Mau case, that has often inspired, actually, a lot of governments in Africa to now start looking back at historical potential claims, because the way in which the mass media, that is, again, not controlled by us, promoted this case as though it was a victory. I was working with a group called the Mau Mau Justice Campaign and provided legal literacy support to that campaign, met with many of the Mau Mau so-called veterans. And what you find is that that case was actually a token case, a very token case. The settlement that was achieved meant that the class of claimants, which ended up being 5,228, they ended up getting about £2,600 compensation each. Now, that is no real money in terms of the torture that those affected experienced, okay? So what was muted in the court case, and if you can imagine this, I was actually in the High Court. You had 5 initial claimants, 1 died and then 1 dropped out. There were 3 left. None of them were literate in English, so it was absurd to see a European English High Court judge trying to adjudicate a pre-trial hearing in English, and our people who were the victims could not understand that process without translation. It is so actually alien to us. I'm thinking, well, how can we think that flying thousands of miles to Europe is going to be where our people are going? And it was actually very dehumanizing. After that case, the British government, you need to know, only settled because of the courtroom of public opinion. What they didn't want was all the gory stories coming out in the mass media, and everyone, all these other countries and peoples who've been affected now beginning to dig up their own cases. That is why they settled. It was tactical. It was to try and shut down that case. And then afterwards, we find there's another European law firm based in Manchester called Tandem Law that is representing 40,000 Kenyans who say that they were not beneficiaries of that settlement, and that some of the people that got compensated were really descendants of the loyalists who were aligning with the British colonials. So what has it done? It's left the community infighting, fractured and divided, has helped to produce this notion of I'm more oppressed, I suffered more than you, lots of division, and actually the real demands of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army in terms of their liberation struggle, which was about reclamation of the land and everything else, has been muted within that. So the people have received a little bit of money, which is nothing if you're talking about 50 plus years of bills for health treatments, people who were castrated and all kinds of atrocities that I can't even talk about here, who were forced to come into that court. So they are very limited, and they do not result in repairing the communities affected. There's a very good scholar, African-American professor called Professor Carlton Waterhouse. He's done research on a lot of the reparations cases, not just African, but Jewish, Indigenous American, and what he's shown is that most of those cases where compensation has been achieved, they have actually ended up being quite bad for the communities affected, in the sense that they tend to bring about closure for the oppressors, who can then say, well, we've paid you people. That, what more do you want? Than actually helping to bring about the restoration of the affected communities. So I'm not saying that we cannot go after compensation, but you cannot divorce the struggle for compensation from the struggle for the ongoing struggle that we have for African liberation, which is not just a Ovaherer and Nama struggle, it's the struggle of all of us. You cannot divorce it, because ultimately it's a battle for power. That's what it's about. It's not about morality and who's right and who's wrong. It's about who has the power to compel. And a final example I would mention, some of you may have been following what's been happening amongst European nations. Greece. Greece has this claim because it is so impoverished, supposedly indebted, and one of the nations, European nations, it has a claim against is Germany, because they're talking about so-called Second World War, which were really European tribal wars that were internationalized, and how Greece was forced into debt, and now they're seeking compensation, really, to help them out of their own crisis. So there have been various rulings against the Federal Republic of Germany and other European powers who just ignore it, because they can, and they have the power to do so. So let us also look at the precedents of how these nations and peoples treat each other, and that should give us a very good inclination of what's in store for us.